Hey kiddos! Welcome back for story time. I hope that you had a lovely 3-day weekend, and let's just dive on in. We're on chapter 19 of Dr. Proctor's Fart Powder by Nesbo, The Patent Office. When the bell rang for first period, Lisa was still wearing her band uniform. Everyone in the band was standing in the playground, talking about the weird thing that had happened that morning when they were marching through downtown Oslo. About the 2 band members who'd been knocked unconscious, about the ambulances that had come, and about conductor Madsen, who'd been so upset that they thought he might pass out as well. Lisa pushed her way toward the classroom, although through a crowd of children who were all pestering her and pulling on her and asking when they would be able to buy some fart powder because, after all, Independence Day was tomorrow. Lisa was sitting at her desk when Mrs. Strobe entered the classroom, pushed her glasses way out to the tip of her nose, and peered at the one empty desk.
Lisa, do you know if Mr. Nilly is out sick today?
Lisa just shook her head. Mrs. Strobe eyed her with suspicion.
Is something wrong, Lisa?
Lisa really wanted to say no, but she knew that Mrs. Strobe had a special kind of X-ray vision that could see through kids' skulls and into their brains, to where their thoughts were. So Lisa just came right out with it. Nilly's in jail. A gasp ran through the classroom, and Mrs. Strobe raised one of her eyebrows so high that it totally vanished up into her hair.
I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that, Lisa?
Yes, Mrs. Strobe. Nilly's in jail. Actually, to be specific, he's in the Dungeon of the Dead. And then Mrs. Strobe lowered both eyebrows and pulled them together so that it looked like she had a mustache on her forehead.
You used to be someone I could rely on to tell the truth, Lisa, she said, but you've obviously been spending too much time with Mr. Nilly.
But I am telling the truth, Lisa cried.
Nonsense,
Mrs. Strobe scoffed.
Nilly is not in jail. Let's pick up reading where we left off. Page 17, everyone.
He's in jail, Lisa said.
No,
said Mrs. Strobe.
Yes,
Lisa said.
No,
said a voice.
Not anymore.
Everyone in the class turned around and looked at the door, and there was Nilly. He was soaking wet, and the ends of his hair were a little singed, but otherwise, he was exactly the same.
Been swimming in the drinking fountain again, Mr. Nilly?
Mrs. Strobe asked sarcastically.
Just a little altercation with a relatively large anaconda in the sewer, Mrs. Strobe. And we handled it just fine with a couple of explosions.
The students all gasped, but were interrupted by Mrs. Strobe slapping her desk with the palm of her hand.
That's enough nonsense for today. Take your seat, Mr. Nilly.
Nilly did as he was told, but as soon as he was seated, he leaned over to Lisa.
I got your message, he whispered. Sorry I wasn't able to get out sooner. I was unfortunately delayed by a visit to the digestive system of a large snake. What's the situation?
Truls and Trim broke into Dr. Proctor's house last night, Lisa whispered, and stole both jars of powder as far as I could see.
See? You watched them do it?
Yep, Lisa said, to make sure everything went according to plan.
Plan? What plan?
Oh, just a teensy-weensy little emergency plan, Lisa said. There's really not much to say. At that very moment, 5 serious men were sitting behind a long table at the Oslo Patent Office. They were looking at Mr. Train, who was standing on the floor in front of them, going on and on about the amazing fart not powdered that was in the mason jar he had set out on the table in front of them.
It's faster than a race car or a rocket, Mr. Train said. It's better and cheaper fuel than a gazillion gallons of gasoline, he continued. It can move men to the moon, Mars, maybe Mercury.
As he talked and talked, the chairman, who was the most serious of the serious men, stared intently at Mr. Train, because wasn't there something familiar, both about Mr. Train's name and his fat, pear-shaped body? Yes, he definitely reminded him of a boy in the neighborhood he'd grown up in more than 30 years ago. a place called Hovsetter. And the boy was always getting new pets since his old ones went crazy, kicked the bucket, or escaped. He vaguely remembered a Mongolian water vole and a nice little snake from the Amazon. Could this be the same boy, all grown up? When Mr. Train was done, the chairman cleared his throat and said,
All is well and good, Mr. Train, but we here at the Oslo Patent Office cannot grant you a patent on what you call the, fart knot powder you say you invented if you don't know what it's made of. So, as the chairman of the Industrial Property Office, I am asking you to, for the third time, what is your invention made of?
Mr. Train smiled as graciously as he could.
As I've already explained twice, I simply don't remember it all. It sort of happened by accident. I just tossed in a bottle of this, a little of that, and stirred it up over a low heat, and then it turned into this powder that you see before you.
The chairman said seriously. The other 4 serious men chimed in.
We need proof, the chairman said.
Yes, proof, the other 4 said.
What kind? What kind of proof?
Mr. Train asked, looking at the clock. The men from NASA had said they'd be arriving on the 2 o'clock flight from Houston, and he'd been hoping to have the patent signed and ready before he met with them at 3.
A test,
the chairman said. Exactly, the others said. A patentable patent test. Mr. Train looked at them uncertainly.
You must demonstrate for us, the chairman said. A very small dose, of course, just so that we can see that this is what you're claiming appears, reasonably likely. Of course, Mr. Train said, obviously nervous. Of course, my dear gentlemen of the Patent Office. By all means, please wear that, said one of the serious men, pointing to a helmet hanging on a hook on the wall. Although it didn't help the last guy that used it very much.
Who was that? Mr. Train asked meekly.
A guy who thought he'd invented a new special gunpowder for the cannons at Akershus Fortress, said the chairman gravely. It turned out it was far too explosive.
The other 4 shook their heads somberly and crossed themselves. Then Mr. Train put on the helmet, walked up to a table, and stuck the teaspoon down into the mason jar of powder, making sure he took only a tiny little bit. Then he swallowed, squeezed his eyes shut, and waited, and waited, and waited. But nothing happened. Nothing that he noticed, anyway. But then he heard the 5 men starting to murmur back and forth to each other. Remarkable, one of them said. Highly unusual, the second one said. But haven't we seen this before? The third one said. Mr. Train cautiously opened one eye and saw that the 4th man leafing through a big book. Here it is, the man said, pointing to a book. This invention has already been patented. The chairman cleared his throat and became even more serious.
Mr. Train, you're a fraud who's trying to steal Dr. Proctor's invention.
Mr. Train stared and then sputtered. Has that darned professor already patented the fart-knot powder? Fart-knot powder? Certainly not. We're talking about an essentially rather unsuccessful invention called Dr. Proctor's light green powder. Look at yourself, my dear sir. Mr. Train looked down at himself, and he emitted a shriek of disbelief, because he was glowing a phosphorescent green and was partially transparent, like some kind of see-through larva. At that same instant, in Mrs. Strobe's classroom, Nellie leaned over to Lisa's desk and whispered skeptically,
You did what?
I broke the cellar window, snuck in, and glued a new label over the old one on the mason jar containing Dr. Proctor's light green powder.
And on the new label you wrote...
Fart-knot powder, Lisa giggled. Store out of reach of children. They ducked as they saw Mrs. Strobe's eyes sweeping across the classroom, searching for the source of the whispering.
And then?
Nearly whispered. I put a mason jar full of regular fart powder next to the other jar, so Truls and Trim wouldn't suspect anything, she whispered. Then I put all the fart knot powder and the regular fart powder that were left in my backpack.
And what did you do with all that powder?
Hid it in my closet.
And then you watched Truls and Trim?
Yep, I watched them from my bedroom window. They broke in and took both of the mason jars.
I wonder where they are now. I didn't see them on the playground before the bell rang.
Oh, I know where they are, all right, Lisa said, forgetting to whisper. There was actually this very weird accident when the band was marching in downtown Oslo this morning. Something fell out of the sky.
Lisa!
Mrs. Strobe slapped her desk.
Mr. Nilly, what are you two talking about?
Nilly cleared his throat.
We were just discussing why women like Lisa and yourself are so much smarter than us men, Mrs. Strobe,
Nilly said.
I think that women ought to take over the world.
Mrs. Strobe looked at him, bewildered.
But it was just a thought, Nilly said. And since I'm a man, it was probably a very dumb thought. So I say let's forget this whole thing, and thanks for your interest, Mrs. Strobe. Please, just pick up where you left off.
The corners of Mrs. Strobe's eyes twitched. Her prominent nose and the corners of her mouth twitched. But before she managed to say anything, there was a loud knock on the door.
Come in,
she yelled quickly, actually sounding like she was relieved to have an interruption. The door opened and there was a man standing there with a pair of dark aviator sunglasses perched on a short, thick nose with black pores.
Good day, Mrs. Strobe, he said. Pardon me for interrupting.
Come in, Mr. Madsen.
Come in, Mr. Madsen. What can we do you for?
The director stepped into the classroom and cleared his throat.
We have a little crisis. Or to be more precise, a big crisis. As some of you know, there was a freak accident at our marching band practice this morning. Something very heavy and very hard and very unexpected fell out of the sky and 2 of our musicians on the head. They're in the hospital with mild concussions. The 2 students are Truls and Trim Train.
A murmur spread throughout the classroom, and a couple of almost inaudible hurrahs could be heard. Mr. Madsen cleared his throat again.
And now the crisis is that the 2 of them will not be able to play with us in the Independence Day Parade tomorrow. In other words, I'm looking for someone who can stand in for them at an extremely short notice. Someone who plays the, trumpet.
Lisa looked at Nilly, who was sitting there with his mouth hanging open, staring at Mr. Madsen. Mr. Madsen shuffled his feet and looked like he was feeling sort of uncomfortable, but then he continued.
And if I'm not mistaken, there's someone in this class who plays the, trumpet. A boy with a perfect pitch. A boy named, Nilly.
Everyone turned to look at the red-haired, tiny little guy who was now studying his nails with a distant, aloof expression.
Nilly?
Getting my voices mixed up.
Nilly,
Mrs. Strobe asked.
Yes, Mrs. Strobe? Aren't you beside yourself with happiness, son? You're going to get to play with Mr. Madsen and the Dolgen School Marching Band in the big parade on May 17th.
Nilly squeezed one eye shut and stared thoughtfully off into space.
The 17th of May. May 17th. That date sounds familiar. No, yeah, now I remember. Isn't that Norwegian Independence Day? Because, first of all, I already have a lot of plans for Independence Day. I was planning to drink some traditional eggnog. Then there are a few sack races I signed up for. Then, of course, I have to defend my title as the reigning champion of the great egg-rolling race of Eggadal. And that isn't even in the toughest group, the hard-boiled egg group.
The kids started laughing, but an extraordinarily powerful palm against teacher's desk slap shut them all up again immediately. Apart from Nellie, of course.
In short, he said, it may be difficult for me to squeeze my trumpet playing in on that particular day.
Mr. Madsen grimaced and groaned in despair.
Unless,
Nellie said.
Yes?
Mr. Madsen's face lit up.
Yes, tell me.
Unless I'm asked very nicely, of course.
Yes, I'm asking nicely, Mr. Madsen cried out.
Or even better, unless I'm begged.
I'm begging, Mr. Madsen wailed.
On your knees?
Nilly asked. And Mr. Madsen dropped to his knees and begged while Mrs. Strobe's glasses slid 20 inches down, while Mrs. Strobe's glasses slid 20 inches down her nose at this unusual sight.
All right, Nilly said, leaping up onto his desk. I'll play. Just make sure you have a uniform that's small enough.
And then all the kids cheered. So did Mr. Madsen. And although it was hard to tell, even Mrs. Strobe did a little bit on the inside. And while they were cheering, Lisa whispered a few words into Nilly's ear. And then he stuck 2 fingers into his mouth and whistled so loudly that the keyhole in the door made a squeaking sound. And suddenly it got totally quiet again. Let me show you guys the picture. Look at Mr. Madsen begging Nilly to play the trumpet. Finally.
Now, a message for all children, Nilly yelled. This afternoon, we'll be selling fart powder in Lisa's yard. Right, Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa said, jumping up on her desk. And we're lowering the price to 25 cents since it's cheaper.
Isn't she smart?
Nilly said. And with that, the cheering started again. And since the bell rang right then, Lisa and Nilly were carried out of the room in triumph. Mrs. Strobe and Mr. Madsen were left standing there in the classroom, watching them go, shaking their heads and laughing. Those 2 are quite a pair, aren't they? Mr. Madsen said.
They sure are,
Mr. Strobe said.
But there was just one thing I was wondering about.
Yeah?
What?
Oh, gosh. Voices.
What's hit Trules and Trim?
That's the most mysterious part of the whole thing, Mr. Madsen said. Believe it or not, it was a manhole cover. Bum, bum, bum. All right, guys, that's chapter 19. We only have like 3 chapters left, and then we are done. We've read a whole book while we've been on quarantine. So proud of you. I hope you have a great week. I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and the people that you're with. I miss you a ton, and I will talk to you later. Bye, kiddos.